Our search for the wild morel mushroom takes us to Central Oregon. We will be staying at Annette's house near Lapine. I needed to mow the lawn and do a few things around there anyway, and so we'll get in the car and drive out to a burned off area. The morel mushroom always usually grow in an area that had been burned off the year before. We start finding the highly sought after morel mushroom right away. Sometimes they're alongside a partially burned log. Other times you find them just poking their head up through the pine needles. Usually they're close to a pine tree or some other kind of a tree, but not always. They can be any place out here. We first take a knife and cut them off so we keep them clean, and then the law requires you split them in half so you won't be able to sell them. Some people would go out and pick these and sell them, and they're worth about $50 a pound on some years, and so they're quite an expensive mushroom. Each person that picks these mushrooms has to go to the Forest Service and get a permit. The permit is free, but you have to keep it with you, and you're only allowed to pick mushrooms about 10 times a year, and each day you're allowed only 2 gallons per person, which is quite a lot of these morels. So anyone who picks these mushrooms should have a good current mushroom book with them so they can key them out. The morels are one of the safer ones. They can't be mistaken for other mushrooms as easily as some of the others. So they're a pretty safe mushroom to pick if you're not real familiar with them. We keep watching along every little piece of log and under each root and down log, and even right in the midst of the pine needles. These mushrooms are just growing all over in the area, and usually they happen in May and the early part of June, although this year things were later, so we were finding them in the latter part of June. Sometimes if you look real carefully, you can see one trying to poke his head up right through the pine needles in the burned out forest area of Central Oregon. They're known as the narrow-cap morel. There is another type of morel that grows in deciduous forests under apple trees or cottonwood trees or quake and aspen, and it's called the edible morel. But these are just almost as good, not quite as big as the edible morel, and the edible morel might be slightly better eating, but there's certainly nothing wrong with these. These are really excellent, and they have a real distinct, stronger flavor. So if you put them in a dish as something, that mushroom flavor always comes through. And we find it much easier just to clean them as we pick them, and they must be split in half while you're out in the field. If you were to be checked without them split in half, you could be eligible for a citation. I've never seen anyone that didn't like the morel mushrooms for eating, and we're not the only ones that like the morels. As we look around, we see lots of deer tracks, and pretty soon we look out, and here's a bunch of deer out. It's mainly a bunch of old does, although we did notice one little 1-year-old buck standing right ahead of us. We can see his little nubbins sticking up skyward. They're still in the velvet and will grow much more even from now. But I expect the does might have little fawns now, but probably they've got the little fawns hid someplace while they're out feeding. The little buck is now right ahead of us with his little nubbins sticking up, and he's a mushroom eater too. These mushrooms can be dried quite easily by stringing them on a string and hanging them in the sunshine, but you want to make sure there's no deer around when you do this. By now we have enough mushrooms for a great feast, and we're going to go on and do some other things. One of the things we need to do is to go cut some firewood. So we got a firewood permit from the Forest Service, and we go up about 18 miles from La Pine into a lodgepole grove to cut down some dead lodgepole. The wood was pretty well picked over, but we managed to saw enough to put a load in the trailer, and then I found where an old tree had rotted away, and I couldn't pass this up. I had to pick up some of the old knots that didn't rot when the tree did. These knots are super good wood. They're full of pitch, and you have to be quite careful when you burn them. If you burn too many of them at one time, you'll overheat the stove because they're so pitchy and such great wood. It didn't take us long to get our load of wood, so we're all loaded up and ready to go back and unload our load of wood in a Net's little shed. We still have more permits for wood, but we're going to wait till a little later on when the snow melts so we can get into a better area. This was pretty small stuff and pretty slow going, although those pitchy knots are always great. When we get back to Annette's, we look out the back window, and here's an old doe out mowing her lawn right behind her house. We watched right out through the window as this doe moved around. We have received word that their fish are biting real good at Diamond Lake, so we're going to get in the vehicle and drive about the 67 miles from Annette's house to Diamond Lake and test the water and see if some of those big fish are biting. We move right along the high altitude roads of the east slope of the Cascades. We can see several snow-capped mountains ahead of us, and we're within about 10 miles of Crater Lake. But Crater Lake, there's only about one way you can get in Crater Lake now because of the high levels of snow. So we're going to go around and go in Diamond Lake. We arrive at Diamond Lake and find it to be a very pretty, clear, high mountain lake with even a snow-capped mountain in the background. And there are lots of boats out here fishing. It's a little too highly populated for my taste. We had a little inflatable raft. We were going to put it together and move out away from shore a little and try some fishing out there. But we didn't want to pull it through a bunch of lodgepole thickets, and so we decided to go to a boat ramp. We went to the boat ramp to try to launch it, and there were so many vehicles there launching big fancy boats that we couldn't even get in, and besides there was no place to park. So I think we'll just load up our 6 little fish that came from near shore and head back to La Pine and try a little mushroom hunting again. At least we do a little better there, and there's not so darn many people. We talked to Kent, and he wants to go mushroom hunting, so we head out mushroom hunting. First we see a couple exploding puffballs, then we start finding the highly prized Morel mushrooms. We cut them off at the base, and boy, they make some good eating. Roxy's along with Kent, and Kent is an old timer at hunting mushrooms, but Roxy, this is her first time, so she's learning just how to do it, how to split them and load her basket up with them. We clean them, split them in half, and put them in the basket. These mushrooms can be dried or frozen. The way you dry them, you just string them on a line and hang them out in the sunshine, or you can freeze them or just eat them fresh. They're excellent however you do it. We like to dry a few and keep them to put in spaghetti sauce. You can make soup out of them or throw a few in stew, and they have just an excellent, very dominating flavor. And so no matter how you fix them, that mushroom flavor is going to come through very pleasantly. No wonder they bring so much in the marketplace. At first, Roxy had some problem finding them, but after a while, she learned the technique. You just have to sort of learn how to find them. The little frog is sitting there with an ant crawling up his back. He should know what to do with that ant. By now, it's getting late in the season for hunting mushrooms, and our vacation is growing to an end, so we decide to head over to the other side of the Cascade Mountains. The snow caps are shining like jewels in the background as we go through Sisters and head over the summit of the Cascade Mountains. When we get over the summit on the west side of the Cascades, we saw a totally incredible sight. It was a true albino deer. It was a 1-year-old buck with pink eyes and everything. The odds of seeing an albino deer are quite slim. There's only one fawn out of about 100,000 that's born to be an albino, and then they have a very slim chance of reaching adulthood. Usually they don't last even 1 year, but this one is 1 year old, so he's done pretty good. We park at the parking lot at Cougar Hot Springs and make the about a half-mile hike up the trail to the hot springs. First we pass along Cougar Reservoir and then the lagoon with the pretty waterfalls crashing down into the waters of the lagoon. The Scotch broom are blooming all around it. We go past the sign, past the little registration booth, and we've already paid our fee. Since we have a senior pass, it's only half price for us. And so we'll start up the trail toward the hot springs after reading the rules to see that nothing has changed. We go up the trail through an old-growth forest community. There are many overhanging trees, and we can peek out and see the parking lot out beyond us through the fir and maple and alder. There are even a few rock outcroppings covered with many species of fern. A few trees overhang the trail, and many places you can look out and see the waterfall crashing to the lagoon. There are a few old growths that have fallen down, and a hole has been cut through them for the trail. Some viney maple grow in the dense shade. There's much moss growing on some of the old windfalls. The Pacific yew is also along the trail in many areas. A starflower graces the edge of the trail with its pretty little blossom. The salal and the bunchberry are in full bloom at trail's edge as we move our way closer and closer to the hot springs. The windfalls are still laying there with just a hole cut through them, and the ferns are taking the opportunity to grow everywhere in this dense rainforest community. The giant old trees that have crashed to the forest floor are mostly old Douglas fir. A few bracken ferns are uncoiling their fiddlehead right at trail's edge. Red huckleberries growing great at trail's edge. The Pacific yew are every place along the trail. A mother tree has captured some seeds of some hemlock, which will be growing right in the old tree. The maidenhair fern can be seen in various places along the trail, and the salal, a little spittle bug, is living on a weed. There's actually a little bug in that little bit of spittle, and that's sort of a cocoon or a place for him to live. There's actually a bug in there. A centipede slowly makes his way across the trail in front of us, and we can hear the water of the hot springs roaring as we get closer. There's a little bridge and some guardrails just before we go down to where the hot springs are. It's always a good feeling to finally reach the hot springs. There is a little shelter built for you to change your clothes and hang your clothes in on a rainy day. Then the pools are right below us. Each pool has its own unique temperature. The top pool is about 108 degrees, and it gets cooler as you go down. These pools are built of native stone, and the water comes gushing out of a cave and into the first pool and then spills down to the second. There's also a cold water stream running right alongside the hot stream, so some places the cold water leaks in and helps cool it on a hot day. There's a pool for every day of the year, I think. Some of them hotter and some are cooler. After an all too short visit at the hot springs, it's time for us to head on down the rest of the Cascade Mountains toward home. There's a little fog hanging over the snow-capped peaks as we make our way homeward bound. Since summer is all too short here in the Pacific Northwest, we stop along Highway 22 to see some of the flowers in bloom. The beargrass's single spike of flowers with its lacy blossoms is growing really well right in the floor of the forest. There's some little wild iris right amongst the leaves of the beargrass, and the wild rhododendrons are always really spectacular. There's even some mushroom growing right under the underbrush, and Marge is taking full advantage of all the beauty, taking her some pictures. For safety's sake, a good book is a must when you're going mushroom hunting. You can key them out and see that you're not accidentally getting one of the poisonous varieties, although morel are probably the safest.